Welcome everyone, Costin here with the final part of my Tomb King's guide for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. I'll be going over unit recruitment and research. When it comes to unit recruitment, by default in every settlement you get the ability to recruit skeletal warriors and skeletal spearmen. What is the difference between the two of them? Because they're fairly similar units, though skeletal spearmen I think are generally going to be better because they have a higher leadership. They have more melee defense, though less melee attack and less weapon strength. Though they do have a fairly significant bonus against large. But I do think that they're generally just gonna do better at being line holders than the skeletal warriors, because they also have some other things like charge defense bonus versus large, charge reflection as well. So they are just going to handle themselves in a better fashion as line holders. For pure damage, yeah, the skeletal warriors are probably better against most units with the exception of large units. But those are your default units. And generally speaking, you only want to get skeletal warriors or skeletal spearmen if you don't have the capacity for everything else. So what should you prioritize in terms of capacity? Well, if you're playing Ark in the Black, you may want to get Grave Hills in pretty much every single one of your settlements. Though bear in mind that Grave Hills, although they will give you a lot of unit capacity, the units themselves over here for Archon aren't necessarily the best, though he does get some improvements to them through his skill tree. Don't get me wrong. You can get a lot of units very quickly, so early on in the campaign getting a bunch of bats, direwolves, and crypt ghouls is generally going to be much better than relying on other structures. So it's more of an early game benefit, though Archon does get some substantial benefits to them. Leadership in his army, melee attack 15, charge bonus for direwolves, and hexwraith, so he does get some fair advantages as well as recruit rank. So I would say until early on in the early game, it is worth getting that more so than most other things, or getting some of those grave helps, because you get 12 unit capacity for a bunch of units. Now, if you're not playing Archon, but even with Archon later on, what you may want to focus on really is the crypt barracks. If I look at unit recruitment, until you start getting into tier 4 and really tier 5, you've got 3 main choices. You've got the barracks, the stables basically, and the Shopti, though that takes you tier 2. So where do I stand on this? Well, I think in general, going for the barracks is going to be the best option regardless of the Tomb King Legendary Lord that you're playing, with the exception of course, Archon. But even for him later on in the game, focusing on barracks might net him more benefits than the Grave Hills, because each barracks will, tier 3 barracks, will give you 4 Nehekara warriors, 6 skeletal archers, though those are relatively meaningless, but Tomb Guard, 2 capacity to Tomb Guard, and 1 capacity to Tomb Guard with Albert. So that's 3 units per tier 3 barracks. And those units are pretty good. Tomb Guard are really good line holders. What you need to know about the Tomb Kings is that skeletal archers and their chariots and cavalry just aren't the best in the game. They'll get the job done, I suppose, but when it comes down to it, you don't want to rely on the skeletal archers of the Tomb Kings. Like, these 4 are the ones he started with, I believe, in the campaign. The reason you don't want to rely on them is the archers don't necessarily have the best damage or leadership or anything like that, or survivability, because they have relatively low armor, and you're going to get bigger benefits if you focus on Tomb Guard and if you focus on Nehekara warriors, which are pretty solid units in their own right. So focusing on the barracks for Tomb Guard and Nehekara warriors is your best choice, regardless of the Legendary Lord you're playing, with the exception of, like, I know, the first 10 turns for Archon, and even then to a limited extent. Like, barrackses, crypt barrackses are your best choice. Royal barrackses, really. But past that, what else should you focus on? Well, here you have a choice. I would never bother with the Tomb Scorpions. It's not that they're bad. In fact, quite the opposite. They're pretty solid. But the thing is, you only get one per tier 3 barracks, when you can get a lot more from some other structures. From quite a few other structures when it comes to playing the Tomb Kings. One thing you could focus on is the chariot building. Not for the chariots themselves, no. But for the tier 3 one, the Screaming Skulls. Like, I would not get a chariot building until I got the tier 3 settlement. But when you get to a tier 3 settlement, you can get one Screaming Skull per tier 3 settlement. Per tier 3 skull repository, basically. The chariot chain gives you a Screaming Skull. Otherwise, you're going to have very limited artillery, and artillery is important for siege battles. Even if you may focus on a melee army, just having that artillery gives you a significant amount of power in a fight. And opens up a lot of options that you otherwise wouldn't have. You are not going to have a lot of artillery, just bear that in mind. Because with the exception of Screaming Skulls, your only artillery options are just to get Casket of Souls. The problem is, Casket of Souls are pretty good units. The problem is you can only get them from a right with a 15 turn cooldown. So you're not going to have a lot of these through the course of your campaign. You're going to have them very limited. And you really should deploy them in some of your best armies just to protect them. Because losing that, it's not easy to recover from their loss. If you're playing Kotep, he does have a casket as a mount. But outside that, this particular right is the only way to be able to recruit one. And so the point is, with regards to chariots, like priority, I'd focus on barracks, followed by chariots, though you could also focus on some other units as well. Cavalry-wise, I would not necessarily bother with the cavalry, although the stalkers are pretty solid units, but I think the cavalry chain is just not something I necessarily would devote a lot of attention to, because although the top tier cavalry is pretty good, the cavalry below that, like until you start getting into tier 3 and then really into tier 4, because at tier 3 you're only getting one Necropolis Knight and 2 Stalker units. The Stalkers could be worth it, but I do prefer having Screaming Skulls. I do prefer having Tomb Guard, though they could do a decent enough job. The problem, of course, with cavalry is due to all the sieges, minor settlement battles, potentially, once the AI gets a bunch of garrisons. But due to all the sieges you're going to be fighting, the walled settlements, cavalry obviously is going to be more limited than infantry, or artillery, for that matter. But I would prioritize the barracks, and then I would prioritize chariots. But what about other units? What about the Ushapti? Well, that's an interesting question, right? Because the Ushapti building only gives you very, very limited capacity, so you need a lot of them. The way to view this is a couple of Ushapti are not going to be a game changer. A Screaming Skull can be a game changer in a battle. A handful of Ushapti are not going to matter as much. But if you can get a lot of Ushapti, that's a very different discussion. Because it is quite possible to be able to get a decent amount of Ushapti. Perhaps even more so than it is to get a bunch of Screaming Skulls. And besides, you don't necessarily want a lot of Screaming Skulls. Like, you want 2, maybe 3 Screaming Skulls per army. But Ushapti, like, you can just make an entire Ushapti stack, and it can be absolutely devastating to your enemies. Like, the Ushapti's great bows can be absolute lord and hero killers. Like, I've seen these guys take down Scarbrand, and it's like, he didn't even reach my lines, and it was the Regiment of Renown variant, which is better, significantly better. But yeah, Ushapti with great bows, pretty strong. Like, archers, not that strong. Skeletal archer chariots, not that great. Ushapti with great bows, pretty damn good when you think about it. Because they've got long range, very long range. And they've got a ton of missile strength. These guys hit like a truck. So, priority-wise, here's what I'd focus on. If you're playing Archon, yeah, you get some Grave Hills. followed up, but for everyone else, it's open graves, the Royal Barracks chain, followed up by choice between skull repositories or getting statues fa for Yolosapien. Like, I would like both these have different purposes. The lowest priority of a main settlement, main recruitment buildings, I would put on the cavalry buildings. At tier 4, in every settlement, you should honestly get Nehekaran Citadel, not just for the Bone Giant, but also for the recruit rank, the Lord recruitment capacity, the casualty replenishment, really. But yeah, all the recruitment capacity and the recruit rank is pretty good. To understand Tomb King armies, it's like they're disposable. You want to get as much ability as possible with the Tomb Kings to be able to replace your armies very, very quickly. Now, don't get me wrong, you will always have a lot of local recruitment capacity because, like the Greenskins, the Tomb Kings get local recruitment capacity for each settlement they hold. Now, that's until tier 5. At tier 5, you're not going to be able to get everything, right? Unless you start throwing away other structures, and I wouldn't say that's necessarily worth it. But what would I prioritize between the War Sphinxes, the Necro Sphinxes, and the Herosians? Well, I would certainly prioritize the War Sphinxes as being the top tier unit. Though Necro Sphinxes can also do a pretty good job. Like, both of them will do a pretty good job. Though the War Sphinx obviously will do a bunch of ranged damage as well, because it does have some pretty good capacity. Like, both of these choices would be good. I would certainly not prioritize the Herosian, though. It's not that the Herosian is bad, far from it, but between these two, like, yeah, War Sphinxes have a lot of charge bonus, very significant charge bonus. Necro Sphinxes are better stand-up melee combatants by the looks of it, like, just a bit better, but they like the range ability. And Herosians, they do have a lot of melee attack, they do have a lot of melee defense, but they're not as flexible in a battle as the Necro Sphinxes and War Sphinxes are going to be. So I certainly prioritize the War Sphinxes. Necro Sphinxes as more of a unit you can just throw in the fight and forget about it. War Sphinxes, for the sake of charge bonus, better when it comes to that. And that's what it boils down to when it comes to recruitment. Always remember that Necrotechs can increase capacity for some of these units, like be it Yolosapien or Tomb Scorpions or War Sphinxes, Necro Sphinxes, and Herosians. When it comes to research, now the way Tomb King research works is that you start researching a dynasty, and that unlocks other things. That unlocks various benefits for that dynasty. Most of the research outside of the dynasty research is pretty fast. But each dynasty will slow down your research rate by 30%, though obviously you can increase it in other ways. There are some ways to increase it with heroes, with some items, with some legendary lord skills. There are ways to do it, like Khalida. No, not Khalida. But one of them does get a research benefit. And so does Archon, who I have right here. He does get one. It's not a faction-wide benefit, but I'm pretty certain, yeah, he does get a research rate benefit with the Staff of Nagash if he procures that. So when it comes to research tree, you've got the dynasty, and then you've got the heralds. The heralds do cost a lot of canopic jars. A lot of things, a lot of the good stuff does cost a lot of canopic jars, and you may want to save your canopic jars for the sake of the mortuary call to awaken to increase army capacity and increase hero capacity, instead of getting the heralds. Though the heralds will give you an extra army capacity itself, but it is quite a bit of canopic jars for it, fairly significant. I mean, it's worth it from my perspective when it comes to that decision. It's worth it to get the army capacity through the mortuary cult first, and then get the extra army capacity through this later. And also, of course, the global recruitment duration and the global recruitment capacity. That's all fairly significant, though. Yeah, you're getting a lot of these heralds, but I would not prioritize them until I've gotten one army capacity through for the mortuary cult. And same, by the way, goes for the research here that requires canopic jars. Prioritize saving canopic jars for the sake of this army capacity over here, and then start worrying about spending it in the research. Just get 1 army capacity for the mortuary cult, and then feel free to spend the canopic jars in the research tree. Now, in terms of dynasties, which are the best, which are the ones you should focus on? Well, the very best as a starting one could be the first dynasty. There are a couple of reasons behind this. First off, the first dynasty is going to buff your Nehekara warriors and your chariot units, but really the Nehekara warriors, which you're going to have a lot more of early on in your campaign than you are going to have Tomb Guard. So early on, you might be more reliant on Nehekara warriors. Later on, yes, that's obviously going to be less significant, and the chariot benefits don't mean much. Though you do get a necrotic capacity for cash. You're going to have plenty of that, and you're going to get the Tomb King capacity for cash as well. But very significantly with the first dynasty is that you also get 10% campaign movement range if you're spending 5,000 coins. So the first dynasty is generally the one to go for early on. The second dynasty is focused on cavalry. That's not going to matter all that much, though. Ward save for bone giants can be useful, but not really worth it when it comes to it. In terms of the king for the first dynasty, he's not really that great. I would not bother with him. For the second dynasty, yeah, I would not bother with the second dynasty. The one I would bother with is the fourth dynasty after the first. So the fourth dynasty will give you construction time, will give you income from sacking and looting. That's more significant, though you won't necessarily be doing a lot of sacking and looting. But it does give you a Tomb King if you have the canopic jars to spend. It gives you a Tomb King that gives you more Ushapti capacity, melee attack and missile string for Ushapti. This is the guy you want to give an Ushapti army to, because he's going to do a much better job with it than anyone else, basically. And on top of that, the fourth dynasty is also going to give you benefits to heroes in terms of melee attack, melee defense. Benefits to Hirotians, not important, but armor for Tomb Guard and Hirotians, that's more significant. I would not bother with Dark Brotherhood, but I would certainly get Pride and Service and Stronger Binding. And also the Proclamation. So the first dynasty followed by the fourth dynasty. And one of the things to say about research is you can start researching a dynasty, and if you have the luxury of a campaign situation, not Cetra basically, everyone except Cetra, but if you have the flexibility to not need the second army, then what you should do is get very close to completion and then start researching another dynasty. So for instance, start researching the first, then once it's very close to completion, start researching another one, or over here I could do another turn and then switch to the fourth dynasty. After the fourth dynasty, what should you get? That is an excellent question, and I think the sixth dynasty is probably going to be your better choice. You do get local recruitment and capacity over here. You get the king. That isn't great, so I would ignore him. But you do get substantial benefits for Ushaptis and Ushapti Great Bows, and Necro Sphinxes and War Sphinxes if you want them. So yeah, first, fourth, sixth, in that order. You could also skip on the sixth for a while and get the fifth if you want, just to improve your artillery and Casket of Souls, but you're only really going to get this one research over here from that. The recruit rank can be nice, but yeah, 20% ammunition for skull catapults and reload time reduction sounds great, but it's not actually as relevant as you might necessarily believe. Well, the ammo is, but not necessarily the reload time reduction, I think. I would strongly argue that the Ushapti benefit far outweighs that. And when you have the canopic jars to spare, likely after you've gotten the first and fourth, I would certainly go and try and get the heralds empowered at that particular point. When it comes to hero capacity, try not to spend canopic jars until you've got the heralds empowered and until you've got one extra army capacity for the mortuary cult. Get the extra army capacity for mortuary cult, then get the heralds empowered, and then you can use your canopic jars on heroes and kings. That's my perspective. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you next time.